Alright, welcome back to another video here on Shooting It Straight. Today we're discussing springs. Springs in your pistol and your magazines, to be more specific. Should you change your recoil spring after X number of rounds as a preventative measure? Can you store your magazines loaded? When should I change out my magazine springs? Is it okay to change the OEM factory springs out for aftermarket lighter trigger springs or extra power magazine springs? These are all very common questions and sometimes hotly debated topics, but you need to hear the facts. Now, this is my third and final video I'm shooting for today, and you'll notice I still have the fingernail polish I'm trying to get off. I've been trying to get this off for 4 days now that my grandbaby came over and put on. So just if you notice something weird, that's what it is. I can't get the stuff off. So that's what that is. But anyway, under normal use, under normal use and normal conditions, springs in high quality pistols and high quality magazines rarely lose tension or compression if they've been tempered correctly. Now, springs are made of spring steel, surprisingly enough, which is a very hard steel, even harder than A36 hot rolled steel, and then are hardened further by heat treatment. Now, as long as the springs have not been altered in any way by the gun owner, and that would include things such as clipping a coil off, manually stretching the spring out, or otherwise kinking the spring somehow, or overloading that spring beyond its yielding point, that spring will not lose tension, strength, or compression through simple fatigue. Now, very heavy use of the spring through continual compression and then resting state cycles can cause fatigue, but it would take hundreds of thousands of these cycles to do that. So don't be concerned with replacing your recoil spring after every 2,500 or 5,000 rounds as a preventative measure. Now, if you want to spend the money and do so for your own peace of mind, well, go for it. It's not going to hurt anything. I'm only saying as a fact that it's not required. I'm not telling you not to change it. I'm just saying you don't really have to. Now, as far as magazine springs are concerned, it's the same thing. It will not harm the spring at all to store your magazine loaded to full capacity, even for many years. Just make certain that you do not overload it. In other words, don't try to jam 31 or 32 rounds into your 30-round magazine and then store it. Because when you do that, you will exceed the spring's yielding point, alright? Which can cause permanent deformation of the spring, preventing it from being able to return back to its original state of rest. These springs are designed and engineered to have a specified elastic region. That's what it's called, an elastic region. And if that region is exceeded by too much compression or it's stretched out beyond this region, it will eventually fail. So do not manipulate springs or overload them and they'll work properly for decades. Now, let me address another misconception regarding spring fatigue. Okay, let's say you just got your new replacement spring for your old magazine, right? Okay, you remove the old spring, right? Then you lay it beside the new spring. I don't have a new spring because I don't change them out, but you lay that new spring right beside your old spring right here, right? That's when you notice that the old spring is probably about 2 coils shorter than that new spring. Aha! Well, that's proof that the old spring is wearing out or losing its tension or becoming fatigued, right? Wrong. What you're seeing with the old spring is what is called the known compression factor, also known as the normal setting of that spring. The springs are engineered with this factor in mind, meaning that it was intentionally designed to be a couple of coils longer than it needs to be, so that the spring could set properly at the specified length once it goes into use and is compressed for a period. The old spring is exactly the length the engineers intended it to be, so that it would not lose tension during use. The very same thing is applied to your non-captive recoil springs, such as those recoil springs on a 1911 or Browning high-powered or XDM pistols. All right. Now, let's very quickly discuss changing out your factory OEM springs for aftermarket springs. Just don't. Listen, the springs in your pistol and your magazines were specifically engineered for that particular gun and that caliber. Those springs are calibrated at certain specifications for that gun and that magazine. Altering these things can, and very often do, throw things out of spec and cause issues. My advice is to just leave them alone. Forget about that light trigger spring or that light firing pin spring or a heavy-duty extra power magazine spring. Listen, if a spring requires replacement, just replace it with a factory OEM spring. Now, feel free to replace springs after a certain period for preventative purposes if you want to. That's no problem, it's okay. But if you don't change them out for heavier or lighter springs, if you always use factory OEM springs, and you don't over-compress them by overloading your magazines, and you don't manipulate or alter those springs, they will last you for decades. There's no real need to replace springs on a regular basis for preventative measures, unless it makes you feel better. And again, that's no problem if you do. Look, in the several years that I served as chief weapons armorer for my former law enforcement agency, the only times I had to actually replace a spring of any kind was when it was damaged or deformed in some way. And that was usually done by the officer who stretched out the magazine springs or stretched out some other spring or accidentally kinked a spring, maybe stepped on it or somebody did something. Okay, it was a owner manipulation factor. I never replaced a spring due to failure from spring fatigue. Not a magazine spring, not a recoil spring, including the springs in the tubular magazines of our Remington 870 shotguns. I never had to replace those. Which, those shotguns were, unloaded and then reloaded again during each shift change. We worked 12-hour shifts, so twice a day that shotgun is being unloaded and reloaded. Now, I disagreed with that particular procedure, but, chiefs and sheriffs override me, right? And all of our guns were well over a decade old before I even took over as chief armorer. And we were issued Glock 22s. And a couple of us even shot in monthly competitive matches with our duty Glocks on top of that. We never had a problem. So, you know, there it is, fellas. That's the truth about the springs in your pistols and magazines. I hope you found this information useful. Thanks for watching. I'm Antonius, and I never wear out from shooting it straight with you. Ciao.